Hi, welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. My name is Austin Chadwick and co-host is Chris Lucian. And we're going to have a good time with Paul Moore today on the show. We'll be hitting, we have some great targets. We may not get to them all, but we got a lot of good stuff here. So talking about certifications, talking about mob programming in the Certified Scrum Developer course. And if there's time, we'll get into some story splitting, techniques and value, and maybe talk about the hole in Scrum. But before we jump to that, Paul, we're going to ask you to introduce yourself. But before you do, I do want to mention that Paul has been on the show before, but it was he was part of the mob in a live programming thing at an Agile Open. So we'll put that in the show notes. And it's one of our most popular videos. So thank you, Paul. Maybe you can give an introduction for yourself, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Austin, and hey, Chris. I'm Paul Moore. I'm a technical agile coach, which, the people in this world know what I mean, but what I really mean is that I'm an agile coach who still codes. I know a large number of agile coaches are like, I used to code, but I somehow got away from it and I'm afraid of it. And I found that there's still a need for us people that can talk directly with the developers in the code base about what's going on, about how to be more effective. So I've been doing this for about 5 years, but I've got Agile experience going back to the early 2000s. I've got about a decade of pre-Agile experience that taught me that there had to be a better way to do development. And that's when I discovered extreme programming. And my mission now is really just help people coming into the industry today learn all this good stuff that we figured out 20 years ago, because it's still not entrenched the way I thought it would be.
Nice. Yeah. And I had a similar experience of doing it other ways for quite a while. And so, yeah, I'm with you there with discovering extreme programming and other things. So yeah, that's fantastic. And and so since one of the topics that we were going to talk about was mob programming in a certification training course for Certified Scrum Developer. I think we were discussing before the show, hey, it might be good to talk about the elephant in the room with certifications at all. So what were your thoughts here, Paul?
Yeah, so it struck me again. I was seeing on some of the media feeds this week that people are just like poo-pooing certifications. Like they're coming from a position that, certifications are crap. I can't believe people are doing that. And I just think it's like a position of cynicism and privilege that they're coming from. That I agree, attending a 2-day class and getting a check mark and saying you're certified isn't the best thing. But the managers and the organizations that are coming to us, they want help. They're struggling with how to be better at software development. And they could, find a random person or find the best person who doesn't offer a certified class, but they're kind of going to the big organizations that offer certifications, the Scrum Alliances, the Scrum.orgs, the SAFEs, whatever, with the best intentions. And rather than me saying, no, I'm just going to ignore where the entire market is, I'm going to try and help that market. And that's kind of my position with offering the Certified Scrum Developer training.
Yeah. And what I like about that is there's balance there, right? I mean, if you take 2-day course in anything, it would, to call it I guess I'm trying to think where it came from. Is it like, certified by the government to be qualified to do something or something like that, right? But, with software development being so complex, 2 days is probably not enough to become expert in hardly anything, right? Mm-hmm. But my part of my journey is I was at a traditional company and they were looking to improve, and I got signed up for a certification course. And through that Certified Scrum Developer course, I learned about extreme programming. And before, I didn't really understand it. Mm-hmm. And that's where I learned about pairing, learned about refactoring, learned about test-driven development, learned about mobbing. And so I found, the training within the certification course was a humongous game changer for me. The certification itself, I'm not sure, but so at least part of me, I'm not, maybe is the certification like a a marketing strategy, almost like it's like a gateway to good stuff for people who think in that style? Or I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts?
Well, and I think the certification just guarantees a baseline.
Mm,
So with the Scrum Alliance courses, at least they offer the learning objectives, the things that you're guaranteed to cover.
mm,
But within each trainer, how we cover it, what we actually offer. You talked about pairing. In my class, we do mobbing because the
mm,
learning objective is really about how to collaborate and work together as a team. Doesn't say
Mhm.
pairing, doesn't say mobbing, yet we found those are effective ways to do it. So
mm.
that's definitely on par with what you saw there. I don't know, Chris, if you have any
Oh yeah,
thoughts.
well, I would just say like certifications, I think have so like one thing, I think I haven't really talked about this on the show, but I talk a lot to people about vocabulary being super important.
Mhm.
And so I've seen a lot of developers and coaches just refer to things by the wrong name. And so at a very base level, it's like exposure to vocabulary, which I think I hold pretty dearly. It's like, um, and so because I think that a lot of people do themselves a disservice by not using proper vocabulary when describing
Mhm.
something. And when you refer to something maybe as like a thingy or that chunk of the software, or entering filler words for architectural patterns, design patterns, interpersonal patterns, can be really damaging. And I think that that at the very least, somebody like very entry level would, for 2 days, like you said, Austin, you get exposed to the vocabulary. And so it's like, oh, I didn't really think to look into that. And then all of a sudden it opens up a whole world to you. So I think if it's like, from zero to whatever, then certs can be really good. And I think that, my concern with certs is more on the opposite end, where it's like a employer won't talk to somebody unless they have a cert like that. I think that just like a degree, right? So it's like if you're going to be hiring somebody and they don't have a degree, but they have 15 years of experience in the industry, it's like, does the degree actually really mean all that much? And to some companies it does, and some it doesn't. So I think it's a double-edged sword. It's like you get a lot of good with it, but then you also get some bad behaviors because they want to be. There are often people that want to be able to forgo the interview, like
Mhm.
or the selection process, or use it as a filtering criteria. And I think that's a little bit broken, right? And that might be where some of the displeasure with certifications comes from, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's funny, Chris, that you mentioned language and terminology. In my class, I define unit tests, I define refactoring.
yeah,
As a technical coach, if I hear somebody saying they're doing a refactoring a couple of days in a row during the daily scrum, I'm going to ask them, which refactorings are you doing? Because refactoring should be, narrowly targeted, fine-grained changes to the code.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, if you can say I am refactoring to a strategy pattern to accommodate the
Yeah.
new variations in code that need to be there, that I can infer a lot about what you're doing. If you're just saying I'm refactoring the stuff that deals with the new component that we need, all of a sudden, it diminishes the quality of the communication.
Mhm.
Um and so that's, yeah, that I think is really important, especially when like newer developers want to be taken seriously. I think that there's this tendency to throw vocabulary out the window, or even a coach being respected in an environment. If they know those terms, they're going to be a lot better off when asking for a retrospective to happen, or talking about those things. And so even if you're a non-technical coach referring to something technical, then understanding what refactoring means could mean all the difference in the world for the level of respect that a coach may get from a team, and therefore their effectiveness is directly impacted by their use of that vocabulary.
Yeah. And that's exactly why I am focused on the Scrum developer training, is that I see a lot of coaching, a lot of organizations imposing process and structure on the teams and not really arming them with the ability to deliver in a, quick iterative manner on the software solutions. And that's all the extreme programming magic that we figured out 20 plus years ago.
Yeah. And I think maybe this conversation's helped maybe crystallize some things in my mind, is understanding what, I mean, and for me, before coming into this conversation, what I definitely saw is that a lot of certification courses in the Agile space, especially a lot of the technical ones I've seen, have some excellent content, excellent practices you try out and learn, and exposure, you say, vocabulary exposure. And like for me, it was game changing. So it was always like, oh yeah, certification is like a wrapper around good training, and good experiences. And maybe the certification part, maybe my hypothesis is just understanding what it is and what it isn't. And I think, so for example, if you take certified Scrum Master training, it sounds very authoritative, right? It has the word master in it, has the word certified in it. And I'm just Googling online, and I can see that some certifications have a lot, like in other disciplines, have a lot of strict, timelines and things that you must do to be, qualified for that certification. Where a 2-day Scrum Master course is not that, right? It's pretty light. And so it doesn't mean, you're an expert, but it also doesn't mean, but it also does mean that, like you said, Chris, you've been exposed to some terminology, right?
Yeah. For 2 days.
maybe you went into the, what'd you say?
Yeah, for 2 days.
For 2 days, right? Yeah, you've been exposed to terminology. Some people in that certification course may come into it with really good intent, soak it all up, and it's like the kickstart to an awesome Agile journey. Some people may hardly pay attention, pass the Scantron, and add it to their resume, right? And so, and with the intention of not really trying to learn, just trying to beef up their resume or something like that. And so I think it's almost like certification's good or bad. It's like, well, it depends how it's used and how it's done, right? And so I could see someone misusing it to be like, okay, I came back from certification training. Now you all listen to me. I'm going to command and control, tell everyone what to do, because I know what Scrum is, or I know what TDD is, and you don't. You know what I mean? Like it's almost kind of, where you could also use it for good. Like, hey, I've been exposed to some terminology. I started my learning journey. Maybe I can share something with you now.
And I feel it's almost time for some of the historical aspect of certification here, where pre-Agile in the 90s, I was taking classes at UC Irvine, I was taking classes at Cal State Fullerton, extended education, like a whole semester on Windows technologies or object-oriented technologies, where it was like, instructor going to class, doing homework, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of it, you would get this nice little printed certificate out of it.
Yeah.
And then slowly, somewhere over time, and I don't know if it was like the Microsoft certified network engineer type things or whatever, it morphed into these 2 days, sit in a seat, stay awake and you get certified. And there was a little bit of a transitional period. There was a thing called XP Immersion that was offered in the late 90s, early 2000s. This was like the game changer for me. So like, Austin, you talked about having your eyes open. The one I attended was taught by like Kent Beck and Ron Jeffries and Chet Henderson and Chet Hendrickson, and Martin Fowler was there. Craig Larman was there. It was 5 days. 5 days of lecture, hands-on coding. They had evening sessions. We were just like ensconced with the extreme programming folks the entire time, learning this stuff. And there was no certification out of it. I got a t-shirt. So I still cherish that 20-year-old t-shirt. I don't wear it. It's like, this is the proof that I really learned something valuable. And then that one kind of tapered off. Financially, I'm not sure it was that viable. It was really intensive to get it done. And then around 2003, Scrum started to come up. And Ken Schwaber started to offer his Scrum Master training. $500, 2 days, shake his hand, you get certified. I mean, that was literally it back in 2003, 2005. And it started to take off. It really started to explode. And in order to put some structure and quality around that explosion, they started putting in the quizzes and all of this and that to make it be more than just showing up and getting that certification.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I think, and maybe we've kind of shared some opinions and thoughts on certifications in general. But one thing I do know is that there's your course and a couple others who offer excellent extreme programming and mobbing training. And it's interesting is it's easy for me to name training that's really good for learning design patterns or learning refactoring or learning mobbing or training. And a lot of those names include ones that are certified, certified Scrum Developer courses. And so there are some that I know of that are not through a certification of some kind, but a lot of them are really good. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Like what's, maybe we can just start, since the mob mentality show, what does ensembling look like in your certified Scrum Developer course?
Yeah, well, I intentionally keep my courses small. In the Scrum Master and Product Owner world, it is not a big deal to go to a class with 50 people in it, which I don't know how you connect and learn in that kind of situation. Yeah, there's a lot of group activities, but the instructor themselves doesn't have eyes on what's going on there. So my class is usually capped out around 10, which to my mind is 2 mobs, which is still hard to like get eyes on. But I can see people in the code when they're doing something by hand, where there's an automated refactoring, where they're, talking about code in a certain language, but they're not capturing that language in the code, suggesting a renaming of the variables or the methods or something like that. So that's where I find working together, getting, maybe some of that breadth of experience out there, because I will have people with decades of experience and people that this is their first training fresh out of school, getting them to work together and realize that they don't have to do it on their own. We always joke about that. Our entire lives we're graded and told to do our work on our own. If we collaborate, we're cheating. And yet in the real world, it's not a cheat. You're upskilling yourselves, you're helping each other out, and you're probably moving faster. So that's really why I lean on it. In the older versions of the CSD, it was pairing. That was the only thing that was offered. But I quickly realized that getting together a group of 3, 4, 5 people, they're all going to enjoy themselves. I hear laughter. That's one of the takeaways. It's like, was this fun? And it's like, yeah, it was fun. Go do that at work, take that back to work with you. And surprisingly, out of all the technical practices I've been teaching for 4 or 5 years, mobbing is one of the ones that takes off. One of the ones that I see companies adopting.
Nice.
Right on. That's good to hear.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that, though, is that I could talk to, a dozen different people, and the majority of them have never heard of mobbing.
Yeah.
It just came up again today. It came up earlier this week. It's like the mobbing's still not as deeply known and aware and, utilized as much as it could be.
Nice. Yeah, and maybe getting into some detail will be interesting for me, because I always like to hear how people introduce it. So is it kind of like a lecture lab, and then the lab parts in mobs? Are the mobs kind of static for the few days or a couple days? Like it's like the same, 3 people, or they're swapping around? Like, how do you structure all that? Yeah.
Classic answer, it depends.
It depends. Perfect.
The way I introduce it, though, is that I introduce it with a pair programming subject, because that was the traditional way.
Okay.
And in the XP days, pairing, that was extreme. That was like, you can't do that. How can I afford to spend 2 people's salary on one thing? And then I'm like, well, what if we, dial the knobs up a little bit more, and then introduce Woody, the hunter story, and talking about the fact that out of all the practices that they had a production crisis come up, and mobbing helped them out. They were working together to deliver software and getting better at it. And here's what they discovered. And then when we get into the actual practice, it kind of depends. Sometimes I will have a mixed group from different companies and they want to stay together. Sometimes it's based on language. Sometimes it's just like, hit the breakout rooms and hit random and see what happens. So it really is up to the groups. I will say, though, that I do get a number of non-coders into the class, and they're just thrown into the group too. It's like when you're on the keyboard, I just show them, tell me what to type, tell me what to do. It should be the simplest thing. And I will get, directors and QA folks that are like not developers, part of the group, talking about the problem we're trying to solve and how we can solve it as a group, and seeing results, not waiting for software to come to them, seeing the results as they're building it.
Nice.
It reminds me, years ago, I think a number of coaches had told me that the way that they got people to start pairing was to first tell them about mobbing, and they say, "Wow, 4 people at a computer is too expensive," and they're like, "Well, some people do pairing, which is only 2."
Yeah.
So all of a sudden it becomes like, "Oh yeah, that's much more manageable. That sounds a lot better than 4." So it's funny
Yeah.
how it was kind of used as a thing, but yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I
Nice.
also find in the class that, with a public class of random individuals, you're not going to know how the personalities are going to play out.
Yeah.
And people tend to be a little bit better behaved and polite in a group of 3 than maybe in a group of 2.
Yeah.
I don't get some of those collisions that I've had in the past where I've tried pairing out previously. So I don't do pairing in any of the exercises unless it's like 2 people that want to do, a PHP or something. For the most part, I'll get people that are like, I'm not a Python developer, but I want to see how this mobbing things works out. And we'll try that out.
Nice. Okay, cool. Yeah, you kind of answered one of my questions as well, because you used to do it with pairs, right? In the same course, right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, back in the day for sure. But really, since I've been teaching it since 2018, I've only done the groups, the mobs.
Okay, cool. Right.
Yeah, because I'm an introvert, may not come across that way sometimes, but me one-on-one with another person, not as comfortable as just like chatting with a group of people.
Right on. Nice. Very good. Well, maybe to transition topics, after getting through some of that stuff, is story splitting part of that course, or is that kind of like a separate thing altogether?
Yeah, no, so that is one of the, I don't know if it's one of the key learning objectives, but it's one of the things that I don't think most people appreciate on how to get better at incremental development is to take this big feature, and we've all seen the teams that struggle to get a story done in a sprint, take that big feature and figure out how to break it down into things that you can show progress on every day or so.
Yeah.
So that's even part of the mobbing practice that we do. Before we get hands on keyboard, it's like, here's the problem I want you to solve. Now let's take a step back. What's in scope? What's out of scope? How do we decompose it into pieces that we can then tackle with confidence that we know when we're done and we don't have to revisit it?
Yeah. And I think reflecting on my mobbing experience, primarily in working on, production code, but also from, training events or like an ad hoc conference mob or something like that, is it might be strong to say that being good at story splitting is essential for quality mobbing or quality development. I might struggle to say that, but it makes it way easier because I feel like there's like good chaos in a mob, and then there's like bad chaos. And I feel like a version of bad chaos is when you walk into a team or a mob and you hand them something that's like, okay, here's this gigantic thing, go. And the team doesn't really work out like what we're going to do first, what we're going to do second, what's our first experiment, what's our second one. And what can kind of happen is this kind of weird chaos where, 2 people are running strong with like maybe the back-end security thing. And then another person in the mob keeps bringing up like, well, what's the UI going to look like? And then like, you're just kind of hopping between things in a non-cohesive way. And so like laying out like, okay, there's this big thing and it includes all these pieces, what are we going to experiment with first, and kind of working that out. That really makes it go much smoother in my experience.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I've learned over the years as I've been teaching the course, is that at the start it was, here's the problem, go solve it. And now it's more of, here's the problem, here's how I go about solving it. Because I just kind of have this ingrained nature of taking this thorny problem and teasing apart the different pieces and figuring how they're going to connect to each other. But I call that out now. That's part of that things that we do without thinking about it to a beginner seem like magic. But if we take that time to say, okay, here's this problem, we're going to get, data from a user somewhere. What could that look like? It's going to get a transformation here, and then it's going to get spat out. Well, we can tease apart the inputs and the outputs and focus on the calculation engine portion of it. We know we're going to have to deal with that, but that's another piece of the feature. That's not the primary piece of the feature that we're focusing on. So really helping them understand how to break problems down. And then even when we break it down, what's in scope, what's out of scope? What are the tests that we're going to write? because I do teach test-driven development as part of this, it's not just saying go do TDD. It's like, out of these tests, which ones do we write first? Leading on James Groening's zombies, it comes up every class because somebody will want to pick the hardest test as their first test. And I've learned, don't do that. Let's just start with the zero case. Let's figure out what this looks like from a interface point, what it's going to spit out. We got the zero case solved. Now what happens when we've got like one thing in there? Let's start building the algorithm up from that.
Yes, yes. And I was reading Joshua Kerievsky's new book, The Joy of Agility. And one thing he said was agility requires focus, say no more often, stop starting, start finishing kind of thing. And I think that's what you're really trying to help a mob do, is saying like, out of this huge thing, we're saying no to 99% of it right now. And we're focusing on just this one little piece,
Yep. Yeah. And that's a sub point for all of the exercises, is that talk to the product owner. What do they really want? They presented you with this problem that is like everything that could be possibly done, but it turns out they really need a very small sliver of it. Ask those questions.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think, because then, that is kind of the premise of mobbing, right? Is all the brilliant minds working on the same thing. So you have to get them working on the same thing as opposed to coming, and then you can see all that start to come together. And so if you don't mind jumping into some detail, as far as technique wise, or what are some of your go-to techniques you teach a group or a mob to story split?
Yeah, so I lean on Mike Cohn's Spider, which he put out a blog post a while ago and did a video on it. Gosh, I'm going to say like 7 years ago when I saw it. But it really coalesced all these different strategies of tackling this big problem and talked about how do we break it down into like the paths that can go through the code. How do we talk about the interfaces that may be in play when we're talking to something? Taking an example like, it's got ingesting a lot of data and breaking it down into subsets of the data. And the last piece, the R, stands for rules. Talking about the happy path case. You would be surprised at the number of the developers that when they're presented with a problem, want to figure out the exception cases, want to solve for negatives and all of that. And I'm like, no, focus on the value. Negative path testing is pretty simple, and it's actually not the most valuable part. Let's deliver something that could actually deliver value first. Yeah, so I do that. I also do example mapping. Picked that up from Matt Wynn a while ago. And again, this has been around 5+ years, and most people don't know about it. But what I find with example mapping is if I've got a story and they start spelling out the rules that are going to go into implementing that story, the examples for those rules almost one-to-one turn into unit tests. They're almost directly test cases that I need to implement. And that really helps teams understand that this bigger problem that I have is actually a finite number of tests. And when I'm done with the tests, the story's probably done. And if all the tests are passing, then I'm pretty confident that the story's implemented and working. So just a lot, I think the feeling behind what I'm doing is that when I first started learning extreme programming, I got pretty darn confident in what I was delivering. That I wasn't worried about it going in production. I wasn't worried about people poking at it. We had been working on it, building up the safety net of all the tests around it. And when it's done, it's done. Let's move on to the next thing. And just trying to impart that, little bit of wisdom and experience to people that are still in the I'm afraid to touch this code mode. They don't want to break anything. They're scared of what could happen because they don't have that backing behind them.
Yeah. And maybe I got a question for both of you. So story splitting, like getting it into different chunks, like you said, different examples, or I go-to for me a lot is that spider diagram and that picture. So I'll have to put that in the show notes as well. But something that I've been struggling with more that almost feels like gut feel, and maybe this is like advanced Scrum developer thinking or something, but because I feel like when you're just learning story splitting, the act of splitting it and being like, oh yeah, there are these different pieces we can work on, and that corresponds to this test, and this test red green refactor cycle, and now we can move on to the next one. But a challenging problem that it's hard for me to share on is because it's more by gut feel is like in a real world, you are given a big old thing and you can start to split it, but then it becomes like, well, what piece do we work on first? So I guess I would like your guys' hot takes on how do you pick the how to prioritize the first thing to go after once you're starting to slice it.
Yeah. I'll let Chris chime in before I add my points.
Oh, Paul, you can go first.
Yeah.
Well, so for me, there is like so if the product owner, and the business in general cannot bear to have any less than a certain number of features, right? Then I like the diagram in the Lean UX book, which talks about the highest risk, highest value. And so, or the highest risk, highest unknown. So it's like a four-way axis. And you want the highest risk and highest unknown, but developers tend to greenfield a MVP solution in the lowest risk, highest unknown, right? And what you get is all of the timeline risk is backloaded. It's basically at the very end of the project you do the hardest step, and that's just a fundamental anti-pattern. So if it's a minimum viable product and it can't be deployed in any smaller subset, always do the most highest risk, highest unknown, the most difficult thing first. Because then you could decide to stop doing the project way early, rather than saying, okay, well, this is what the button's going to look like, and we can make sure we can click the button. And by the time you get to the algorithm you want to run, it's like way too late, and now you've doomed the project, so to speak. So there's a minimum viable product, and convincing the business to bring it down as far as possible, then using the Lean UX, like highest risk, highest unknown, knock those out. And then if you're in kind of a feature slicing where you can deliver thin vertical slices after an MVP is out, I tend to like doing feature flag by user if it's a multi-tenant system, and then being able to roll out small portions of features to subsets of users gradually over time. So I think Etsy is known for doing an extreme version of this, but then you can get like really small increments out of even a subset. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's like mainly strategically in my head. I work through maximize discovery until deployable, then maximize iterations.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, that was exactly where I was thinking, was like identify the risks and uncertainties and tackle them first.
Yep.
If we know how to do something, great, but that's not where the real challenge is going to come up. And then the other thing that I look for that's kind of off from what you were mentioning is there a way to parallelize any of the work? Can we identify interfaces and coupling and put a split on that and have things broken up that way so we can get more things working in parallel than just waiting for a sequence of things to happen?
Yeah, nice. And I think that's the struggle for me a little bit is I think, so we recently went through this in my mob, and there were two things going on at once. We were learning how to work in a new technology, like the nuts and bolts of how you do a TDD loop in this new framework, basically, for example, right? But then at the same time, there was quite a bit of unknowns at the same time. And so it felt easier to like, hey, let's do the simplest feature in TDD so we can just get the flow. And I think we did do that just so we like got our feet wet. Yeah. But we didn't do that very long. And then for a significant amount of time, we were, floundering around in R&D land where you run an experiment. It doesn't work because you're trying to figure out how to do something that's kind of new and novel or hasn't been done before or whatever, right? And that's not like a tight little TDD loop in a lot of cases because you're just like, well, we don't even know how this technology works. And so you run an experiment and find out, and you can kind of guide it by tests as you go. And so I think I almost, there's almost like, what's your goal, right? So for example, in a course, like what you run, Paul, you may not want to throw them in the deep end of giving them a problem they've never.
Oh yeah,
some new novel problem.
I'm upfront about that the problems are intentionally simple.
Yes,
they're just a scaffolding that we hang the practices on.
Nice.
So the problems are intended to be solved in an hour or so. if we
Yes.
don't get to it, we don't get to it. But that's part of it too. It's the learning that we take away from
Right.
it.
Right.
But I do talk to the group that,
Yeah.
we've got kata sites out there, we've got different practices. But what I do when I'm doing some of my practice, are you familiar with Advent of Code?
No, not me.
So every December, I don't know who the group is, every December at midnight East Coast time, which is 9 p.m. our time, December 1st through December 25th, they release a coding challenge. And they're intentionally obscure. The language is kind of confusing, and they tend to do like multiple pieces together. So it's not just a simple write some unit tests and you're done. It's usually ingest some data, transform it, perform calculations on it, and then split out an answer. And to me, that really helps clarify how the different things fit together, how I'm going to break it down, talking about those connections. I can easily see that, here I've got a dictionary of a string to a number, and everything on the left of it is one calculation, everything on the right, and I can just, split up the development that way. So I really tackle it more as TDD and problem solving training than, people treat it as like code speed. So you'll see people solving these problems in like 2 minutes. And I'm like, bless you, but that's not the point for me. The point is to get better at taking these gnarly problems that have like imprecise language and figuring out what is really meant here. How can I write a test to prove that out? And that's some of my practice when people are saying that, solving things about how many leap years old you are, or, talking about ISBN calculations of checksums. It's like, yeah, those are practices, but if you want to get into something more real, take a look at this kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice. Oh, that's great. No, I love it. And I think, and it almost seems like you need to, just like with learning anything, if you are learning too many things at once, it's too much to handle. So maybe, like to learn how to story split and TDD loop, the simpler stuff lets you build the mechanics, almost like the shu-ha-ri moment for when you can use those same splitting skills for splitting a difficult R&D set of experiments, right? Yeah.
So in your example, I think, you could argue that the highest risk, highest unknown is whether or not you could create a solid TDD loop before investing more in the technology, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so, you could argue that was following the highest risk, highest unknown paradigm, because you're saying, because I think what I heard was, we're uncomfortable with the testing system, so let's become comfortable with that, and then we're going to go tackle the next thing that we're uncomfortable with, which I think is what you're supposed to do. If you're feeling confident about what you're working on, while there's stuff that you feel uneasy about, that's the litmus test. That's the problem moment where you're like, okay, we should be working on the stuff we're uncomfortable with now, so that we're not at the end of the project and trying to figure out how to make the core of it work. Like that. That's what I've seen happen all too often. It's like, facade development. There was a developer that I ran into, and I was asked to look at their code. This was a long time ago, before mobbing, and it was like everything was just like label 1005, label 1006, label 1007, and it like only certain options and drop downs were working, but they were like talking about it as if everything was going fine. And the reality was, they were like at the end of their timeline, and they basically had none of the like real meat of the functionality. They had a bunch of UI that pretended to be working. And I think people just tend, like, I don't think necessarily it was their fault per se. I think it was a trap of the system. And so I think it takes experience to understand that, while you'll get quick, easy rewards, it's like binging on candy versus like eating a diet of salads, right? It's like you're gonna see, it's gonna be painful up front to eat the salad often, but your long term is gonna look a lot better than if you just binge on candy constantly, right? And so that's just it. Like, it's a discipline. It's the realization of the discipline that I think is important. And so I think that gut feeling did come out there. So while it might have been an easier problem to solve, it was arguably a more important problem, a higher risk problem to the life of that technology in your project.
No, that's a good point.
Yeah, and Austin, to some of your question about the mechanics of what I'm doing, realizing here we are in 2023, 10 years ago, I would have made an assumption that every developer knows what TDD is, whether they do it or not. But in 2023, I don't think that's the case. It's not taught in school. The wave of people that learn TDD are kind of aging out. And when people are presented with a problem, they're just told, here's your story, go work on it. So the mechanics of my introduction of TDD is just like getting everybody in a cyber dojo classroom setting and going, here's what's going on. What tests are we going to write? Enumerating the tests as a list before we write any code. It's not just getting in and writing code, it's figuring out what path we're going to take. And then literally writing one test first and just enough code to make it pass. And I get feedback that it's like, oh, I've never seen TDD actually done. I kind of knew what unit tests were, but I didn't know what TDD was. And so it's like all the practices, you don't have to use them all the time, but having that awareness of when they're going to help you out and having the ability to bring them to hand without struggling with it is really what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I agree. Then and that's part of the semantic diffusion, right? You'll see the term TDD or test-driven development a lot, but then when you get into the nitty-gritty, it's like, oh, what you think TDD was something completely different than what I know it as, and that's fine. We are coming close to time. Did you want to give your quick soundbite on the hole in Scrum before we close out? Is that possible, or should we save that
I actually have
time?
a talk on it. I can send you the link for that. But basically, Scrum is a framework. The word software appears in the Scrum guide exactly once. And where it appears, it says basically Scrum is trying to move away from software. So there's this glaring hole in the middle of the Scrum framework, which is what does the team do every day after the daily Scrum? They've spent their 15 minutes doing the daily Scrum, then what? Scrum doesn't tell them what to do, which is where I, as a technical coach, bring these practices from extreme programming and beyond to help them fill in that hole.
Nice. Like it. All right. Well, we are coming up on time here, and I just wanted to ask, do you have anything that you'd like to promote or share before we close it out?
My partners at Rocket 9 would love for me to promote all my trainings and stuff. I'll send you the links for that. But really, it's just more getting together, learning from each other, getting better at what we're doing, whether it's certified or not. I think there's just so much we can learn from each other, regardless of where you're at in your career.
All right. And if you, for our audience out there, if you know anybody that's in the middle of getting a certification and maybe feel not confident about it, or if you know a hiring manager that only relies on certifications for hiring or anywhere in between, please share this episode with them. I think it would be good. And then be sure to like and subscribe and ring the notification bell. Thanks, Paul, for joining us today. And we look forward to having you all back next time. And thanks for listening, everybody. Bye.
Bye.